Hi, everyone. This is Mariah with the Ally Center at LBC. Welcome back to the Ally Advantage, where support meets strategy and students thrive. In our podcast, we focus on building confidence, clarity, and skills you can use as an online student. Joining us today from our online team are myself,
And Hannah.
small but mighty team today. And we are excited to cover the topic of sticky citations. And you may say, once again, wow, that sounds really boring, but actually, Hannah and I truly are so excited to talk about citations. Now, uh, sticky citations are things that students often find, and you know what? Sometimes it's not even the students. Sometimes the professors themselves are like, you know what? This is a little bit confusing. This is a little bit challenging. Let's look it up together. We are here to provide guidance on how to cite those sources that you want to use in your papers. Before we get into the nitty gritty, though, Hannah, can you tell us a little bit more about what MLA is? We need to back up. What are our citations and why should we use them in the first place?
Absolutely. So, MLA stands for Modern Language Association, and it is a documentation and citation style. And
Hmm.
so it tells us how we are to set up our documents and how we are to cite our outside sources. And citations are really just a way of maintaining honesty and integrity in our writing so that when
Hmm.
we are using outside authors, outside thinkers, books, articles, what have you, we are giving credit where credit is due and making sure that we are dealing with honesty and integrity in all of our writing ways. And so,
Very important.
yes, always, always. So, we want to make sure that we are employing them properly. And today we are going to focus entirely on MLA. Just so you are aware, there are other citation and document formatting styles. You might have heard of
Hmm.
APA or Chicago or
Yeah.
SBL, but
Hmm.
for the purposes of our podcast today, we are going to focus on MLA, and MLA is the standard citation style for undergraduate courses at LBC. So, though you may encounter other citation styles in specific psychology courses, you will be using MLA in most of your courses.
Right. Right.
So, there are two primary types of citations. There are
Hmm.
in-text citations and works cited entries.
Not
In
confusing at all.
Not confusing at all. And in-text citations are what it sounds like in the text of your papers. And so
Hmm.
within your paragraphs, within the sentences, in the actual body of your paper, you are citing your sources. It is not enough just to have a works cited page at the end of your paper listing out all of your sources because it does not show where your information came from. So
Right.
your professor doesn't know what came from your mind and your thinking
Hmm.
and what
Hmm.
originated from another author's publication. And
Right.
side note, especially as believers, we really want to make sure that we are operating in honesty and integrity in everything that we do because these people have dedicated their lives to studying and publishing and working really hard to get articles published and books published. And so we really want to honor their work and honor what it is they've studied and achieved. And so we do that by citing their sources properly.
And if you don't mind, Hannah, I'll jump in. Whenever we cite sources, we're proving that we ourselves are scholars and that we are building our own credibility by citing those experts. Many of us have expertise in different fields, but usually in school, we're learning. And so, whenever we're writing to an audience, we don't have the credibility of an expert yet. And so, we build that credibility by citing these outside experts. And so, whenever we do that and we show our work, we're showing our audience that we ourselves are trustworthy and credible.
Excellent. Absolutely. Yes. And as you progress through your schooling, if you go on to graduate school and beyond, that idea becomes even more important because you are in the
Right.
process of becoming a scholar yourself. So, as we've discussed, in-text citations are in the paragraphs and sentences of your essay, and each one of those in-text citations corresponds to a works cited entry on the works cited page. The
Mm-hmm.
works cited page follows the essay. So it is the first page after the end of your essay. So it always
Mm-hmm.
starts on a new page, even if your paper is only 2.5 pages, then your works cited page would start at the top of page 4. So on the works cited page, you have every source that you quoted, paraphrased, or summarized in your paper. So even if you're only drawing on the ideas of an author, you still need to cite them properly. So
Right.
it's not just quotes, it is summaries and paraphrases as well.
Mm-hmm.
So these longer works cited entries show the reader where they can access the sources that you cited and where that information comes from. So
Right.
each separate source on your works cited page is called an entry.
Mm-hmm.
So then the in-text citation will tell your author which works cited entry the quote or paraphrase is from, along with the page numbers or timestamps if it's a uh, media source. And
Mm-hmm.
then it will also enable them so that they can look up that specific portion that was referenced.
Right. And so both are important they're necessary, in fact, in order for you to have MLA citation style be correct. Your professor will not be happy either way if you leave out either the in-text
Mhm.
citation or the works cited entry. And so we are going to talk about both of those. But before we do, Hannah, can you tell us just a little bit more about narrative in-text citations versus parenthetical? What a mouthful. Parenthetical in text citations.
Yes, so many syllables.
So
Unfortunately,
many.
I wish whoever named these could have been a little bit more simplistic.
Kinder,
But
kinder to both students and professors alike.
yes, exactly. So as we've been talking about in-text citations, typically, a standard in-text citation appears at the end of the sentence in which that outside information was included in your paper, and it appears inside parentheses, which is the punctuation mark. They're rounded. They're like rounded brackets. Those are the parentheses,
Hmm.
and it will include the author's last name, the author being the author of the source that you're citing, and the page number where that information can be found inside that particular source. Now, that's the standard way. That's called
Yep.
parenthetical citations. However, if you were to include the author's name in the actual sentence, so if you were to cite an author, we'll call her Jane Smith. If you were to say
Hmm.
author Jane Smith argues, and then you, of course, include a summary or paraphrase of what Jane Smith argues, then you don't need to include Smith in the parentheses at the end of the sentence, but you'll still include the page number in parentheses at the end of the sentence to specify where that information came from. But
Right.
to summarize, you always want to include the author, the author's name at some point in the sentence, whether that is a narrative citation, which is just in the flow of the sentence, or inside the parentheses. We always want to give credit where credit is due.
Right. Now, I am perhaps a picky professor, but I will always make my students include the page number just inside those parentheses. And because some people like to say, well, on page so and so, the author says. And I think most professors and the MLA style in general frowns upon that. They don't want to interrupt the flow of the sentence with information that's not relevant. And so keep those page numbers inside the parentheses at the end. Don't add page numbers to your narrative citations. Now, as Hannah talked about, the norm for your works cited page and your in-text citations is going to be the author's last name is going to be the item of preeminence, right? You're going to have the author's last name either in the sentence, so that's the narrative citation, inside the parentheses, that's the parenthetical citation. And so if you're creating your works cited entry, the author's last name even though it's the last name, is going to be the first thing that you see on your works cited entry. Author's last name, comma, and then their first name, and then the rest of the entry. That's normal. And then for your works cited entry, at least, you don't need to include page numbers that you've cited throughout the document. That's just for your in-text citations. Now, this standard way to cite with the author's last name will take care of most of the sources that you come across: books, web articles, scholarly journal articles, etc. It's going to be the author's last name, page number for your in-text citation. Author's last name is going to be the first thing that appears on your works cited entry. However, today we are talking about those sticky, both works cited and in-text citations, and how we can match our works cited entries with those in-text citations. So we're going to go through several things that we consider and that we have had students run across in our times as teaching English and writing classes, things that people have said this is tricky, and perhaps even things that we ourselves have had to look up a time or two. We're going to explain how you set up the first part of your works cited entry and how that will then link to the in-text citation. Because once you figure out the works cited entry, for the most part, that'll then take care of your in-text citations. So without further ado, Hannah, you want to launch us off?
Absolutely. Thank you. So, we are going to start by talking about articles on a web page where there are no individual authors listed. So, when there's no single author or even multiple authors listed, where it's just an article and you have the web page, this can be kind of tricky.
Yeah.
So, especially as online students where you're doing so much research on the computer, online, and you may not be going to an in person physical library, you may be finding quite a number of articles online. First and foremost, just as a caveat, always double check that the source that you're citing is credible. If there
Amen.
is if there is no author listed, we just want to check on the credibility because it
Mm-hmm.
can be credible, but sometimes there are just random blogs on the internet. Sometimes there are just random web pages that contain information that is either faulty, outdated, uh,
Mm,
incorrect. So we just want to be aware of that, that the internet is a useful place and also
a
at times a
scary
scary
place.
place. And so we just want to make sure that the sources that we're consulting are credible. We have plenty of resources in the Ally Center and on the library page about how to determine the credibility of sources. So we won't spend time today talking about that, but just be sure to confirm that before actually citing the source in your paper.
We can actually link some of those sources
Mhm.
in the podcast notes for this episode. So be on the lookout for those if you would like to look those up. Go ahead, Hannah. Tell us more about citing an article on a web page. No author.
Yes, when there is no author and you're looking at the work formatting the works cited entry, just bypass and ignore that first slot in your works cited citation. So usually the author would be listed first. When there is no author, we just skip over it. Don't make up an author. Don't pretend there's an author if there's not. Don't try to generate an author because
Right.
um, that will actually flag as plagiarism. So please,
Right.
please do not make any fabricated information up. Just
Mm-hmm.
start with the title of the article inside quotation marks, and then you'll follow that by the website and the publisher and the remaining works cited entry information. You'll just follow the standard protocol for that. Now, something that is important to note here is that sometimes, even if there are no individual authors listed, an organization could be considered what's known as a corporate author, and that's where you might
Right.
have a government organization or just a large publication or organization that
It's,
is
it's
public,
usually governments. Yeah.
such as, if you were citing something from the NIH or the
Mm-hmm.
CDC. This is where you might cite the corporate author, but it is still really important to cite the article title itself because that will clarify which article you're citing, because of course there are numerous articles on the
Hmm.
CDC website. And so we still want to specify the article title because this will help clarify for your professor where exactly that information is coming from. So in your sentence, when you are including this information, you can always note the corporate author and you can say in a CDC article, they write, and then include a quotation. But at the end of the sentence, in the parenthetical citation, be sure to include that article title in quotation marks. That's just going to, or in quotation marks within the parentheses, and that will just be the most thorough way for you to cite that source.
Thanks for kicking us off, Hannah. The next thing that we're going to talk about is the Bible. Now, hopefully, all of us at Lancaster Bible College are, in fact, citing the Bible, but sometimes doing the in-text citations in the Works Cited can be a little bit tricky, especially because people get confused between the print and the online versions. So, for print, the print edition of the Bible, whenever you're writing it out, you're not going to put an author. God's the author. Not everybody acknowledges God is the author. And so they've decided, the powers that be, that you're going to put the title itself. Title is going to be italicized. Now, if you're looking at your Bible, it may be kind of tricky to figure out what the title is. Sometimes it's titled just like the Holy Bible, the New American Study Bible, Women's Christian Version Bible, whatever. That's going to be the name of the particular book that you're holding, that particular Bible. Then you're going to put the version. The version is sometimes part of the title and sometimes it's not. The version, though, for the print version is going to be after the title, not italicized. This is the confusing part. So you're going to write out New International Version, not italicized. If you are doing the web version, then there's not a separate title. And so the version will become the title. And that's the tricky part because then it becomes italicized for your works cited entry. And then you would go on and list publication information. And because it's on a web page, you want to include the website and the link information so that your readers can access the version that you found. Now let's talk about the in-text citation for the Bible. What's nice is that for MLA, it doesn't matter if you're citing the print or the web version, you're going to italicize the version for your in-text citation. Makes it easy. You are going to put it in parentheses. You're not going to use it as part of your narrative citation. Don't name the version in the sentence, only put it inside your parentheses at the end of the sentence. And you're always going to include the book, chapter, and verse. Always, no matter where you're doing. Even if you're summarizing a section, you still want to let your readers know, hey, this is the book, chapter, and verse or verses that you're citing from. Now, an important clarification in MLA, this is MLA specific, you are only going to tell your readers the version the first time you cite the Bible. Every time thereafter, you can just do book, chapter, and verse. Unless, unless you decided to be crazy and you wanted to use multiple versions. If you're using multiple versions, then you have to tell the reader which version you're using every time, because otherwise there isn't a way for them to try to figure out were they looking at the NIV or the ESV this time. You just got to do it every time. My personal recommendation, personal recommendation, off the clock, is that you just pick one version and stick with it the whole time. And that'll just simplify your life. You only cite the version spelled out in full, italicized, inside those parentheses the first time you cite the Bible. Every time thereafter, book, chapter, verse. Side note on citing the Bible, whenever you are doing your in-text citation inside your parentheses, this is really nitty-gritty. This is getting down to the pickiest of pickiest. But between the chapter and the verse, you're going to put a period if it's inside the parentheses. If it's part of the sentence, then you're going to use a colon, just like you would in normal everyday life.
Yes, and the next type of source we are going to talk about today is master's theses and PhD level dissertations. So, as you're conducting your research. You may come across a master's thesis or a doctoral dissertation that is particularly relevant to the topic that you're writing on, and you may want to use it. So, citing dissertations can feel a little bit tricky, and so we are going to break down exactly how to do that. So, you're going to start with the author's name for the works cited entry. So, last name, comma, first name, very standard. So going with our author from earlier, Jane Smith, it would be Smith, comma, Jane, period. Followed by the title of the dissertation or the thesis in italics. So you're going to want to italicize. It is the title of a longer work, and therefore it is italicized. And then this is where it gets a little tricky. So because it's a
Mm-hmm.
dissertation and it is of particular importance when it was published, when it was defended, you'll want to note the year after the title, followed by a period, and then the name of the college or university where that individual studied, followed by a comma, and
Mm-hmm.
note the type of document that you're looking at. So if it's a PhD dissertation, say that. If it's a master's thesis, say that. Period. And then the container, the database where you found that source, followed by the access link.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the essentials of citing a thesis or dissertation. And then the in-text citation for that source would be the author's last name followed by the page number. So it's going to follow the same format for the in-text citation as citing like a book or something like
Mm-hmm.
that.
And I appreciate, Hannah, how you designate. Now some people are gonna laugh at me, but the difference between, okay, we put a period here and then a comma here, this is how you know the type of nerd that I am, because I do know where the commas and the periods go for each of the citations, and it bothers me when students don't have the right thing. I will say though, from a professor standpoint, that usually professors have a lot of grace for if you have the wrong piece of punctuation between each element of your works cited entry. However, it will bother people a little bit if you don't have any punctuation. You just have one piece of the container running into, or one piece of the entry running right into the next one. You want your professors in a good mood. So just add a period or a comma. Do your best. Don't break your brain about it, but add some punctuation in there. The next citation that we're going to talk about is the Constitution. Now, in your everyday endeavors, whenever you're doing studies, you may not want to use the Constitution. I personally have run into a lot of students who cite the Constitution specifically for the LAN 101 class where they're doing their persuasive argumentative essays, and they're looking for what the law says and sort of our founding documents. And so if you're looking to cite the Constitution, of course, you're going to want to take into consideration where you have found it. Now, if you are reading the physical copy of the Constitution, I don't know how to help you. I only know how to cite it electronically. So, if you have the no, if you have the Constitution, you're always going to put the title italicized on your works cited page, and then if you found it online, you're going to tell us where you got it, just like the Bible. If you found it online, you're going to tell us what's the name of the website where you accessed it. And same thing for the Constitution. If you found it on National Archives, that's going to be on your works cited entry italicized after the title of the Constitution in the version that you found it, right? So I might find the Constitution of the United States, a transcription, and that's the title that that website uses for the Constitution. I'll put that full thing. Now, for your in-text citation, you are going to want to cite Constitution of the United States. For some reason, known only to the good Lord Almighty, you're going to put that inside quotation marks instead of italics. Don't ask me follow-up questions. I have no answers, only things to say. Additionally, you want to make sure that you cite the specific section that you're looking at. So an amendment, an article, within an article, a particular section. You always want to include those specific sub pieces of information so that people know exactly what part of the Constitution you're looking at. Now, as Hannah mentioned earlier, you can decide if you want to cite the article and section in the sentence as part of your narrative citation, or if you want to put it inside those parentheses at the end. But you have to include the pieces of information. And so if you are going to include them inside the parentheses, you're going to abbreviate them. So article would be abbreviated ART, etc. And that's a good general rule of thumb that if you are citing something inside the parentheses, like a book of the Bible, you're going to abbreviate it. But if it's in the sentence, then you'll put the full thing. Back to you, Hannah.
Yes, that's a great point about abbreviations and keeping those in mind, no matter what source you are
Hmm.
using. But that will be most relevant with the Bible and the Constitution.
Yeah.
And next up, we have dictionary entries. So, whenever we are writing, we always want to make sure that we are using terms properly. This is just a general writing tip. We want to make sure that we are using words in accordance with their definitions. And so sometimes students will want to define a particular term that is relevant to their essay, either in the introduction or maybe one of the first body paragraphs where it's just particularly relevant to define a term. Now, of course, we don't want to define every term in our paper, but we want to make sure that our reader is aware of how we are using our terms and how they are defined. And so if you choose to include an actual dictionary entry in your paper, then on the Works Cited page, you should include that particular term in quotation marks. So, say we're citing the word joy, you would start with the word joy, again in quotation marks, followed by a comma. If we want to be technically accurate according to the letter of the law in MLA, then we want to note the part of speech that that word is within, because sometimes words can occupy multiple parts of speech. And so it is helpful to note which part of speech that word that you are defining is operating in. So in this case, we are citing joy as a noun, and that's going to be italicized, but just the part of speech. So just keep that in mind. Followed by a period, followed by the numerical entry in the dictionary that you're using. So a lot of dictionary entries have multiple entries for a word because words can be defined multiple ways. And so in parentheses, you want to indicate which entry that is. So say we're using the number 3, the definition number 3, we would put 3 in parentheses followed by a period and quotation marks, and then we'll note which dictionary we are using. I'm using the Merriam-Webster, and then I'll have the link, access date. That is important, especially when you're citing online, that you have the access date. And then for the in-text citation, you will have inside your parentheses, joy in quotation marks, followed by a comma, and then again, another abbreviation for definition DEF, period, and then the number 3 for the third entry that we're using. So I know that sounded really, really technical, but the heart of the matter is that we are clarifying what word we are citing and defining, what dictionary entry we are citing and defining, and which dictionary we are using.
And I know sometimes people will cite a dictionary that actually does have authors. If there are authors, it's usually not an author, it's usually editors, and that will go later on in the entry in an editor's spot, unless each item has an individual author. And that can be that's formatted a little bit more like a work in an anthology, which Hannah is going to tell us about later. So stay tuned. Just a little bit, we'll talk about how to format that. Let's continue on to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court, again, one of those entries that you would probably not go about seeing in your everyday papers. However, again, especially in the context of LAN 101, when people are arguing about some of these hot button issues of the day, where the Supreme Court is actually making rulings, it feels like every other day on some of these really controversial issues. Some people want to cite the Supreme Court. And so, because it is a Supreme Court ruling, you are going to put United States Supreme Court as the author. Now, it is true that there is an individual justice who is the prime person writing the decision. However, because it is published by the Supreme Court, we actually don't put the individual justice on the Supreme Court ruling. You would only do that in a dissenting case, which we're not going to talk about. Most people don't cite these dissenting cases. However, in the author slot, then for your works cited entry for Supreme Court ruling, you're going to put United States Supreme Court. The next most relevant piece of information, there's lots of information you can include for a Supreme Court ruling. The most important piece of information after the court is the title of the decision itself, Brown v. Board of Education, etc. Then everything else is just additional publication information and where you found it. So whenever you're doing your in-text citation, this is one of those where the rule is a little bit of an asterisk. You're like, this is not the norm. This is the exception to the rule. You can say, hey, this is a Supreme Court case, and in fact, it is encouraged that as part of your narrative in the sentence, you'll say Supreme Court ruling. However, the only piece of information you must include is the court case itself. Court cases are usually italicized, and so you're going to put that in italics either in the sentence or in parentheses at the end of the sentence. If there's an additional abbreviation for that Supreme Court case, you can notate it the first time you use it and then use the abbreviation every time thereafter. But remember, the most important thing for a Supreme Court case is just the title of the case itself. Back to you, Hannah.
All right, thank you. I am learning things myself today, so thank you, Mariah. Our next type of source that we are going to review today, and actually our final type of source that we're going to talk about today, is a chapter in an anthology. Yet another big word that we're throwing around today. It's a type of source that we actually encounter fairly frequently. We just don't always call them anthologies. So an anthology is a collection of works published in one unified book. And so it contains works by several different authors. And as such, we want to make sure that we are citing the authors or author of a particular work, but then also the editors who compiled that collection. So it's a lot of work to write a source, and it's also a lot of work to compile a collection. And so we want to make sure, once again, that we are giving credit where credit is due. Students will encounter anthologies in your FAS 100 course and your LAN 101. And so
Yeah.
the current textbooks for these courses are anthologies. And so it's important that we know how to cite them. So when citing a source that was published in an anthology, we want to make sure that we are starting with the author of that particular source. So once again, last name, comma, first name, and then the title of that work in quotation marks. And so it might be a chapter, it might be a poem, it might be a short story, but whatever that source is, it should be in quotation marks. And then we are going to include the container, which is really just a fancy word for the source that contains that other smaller source.
The longer source, yeah.
The longer source, yes. And that will be italicized. And then we are going to include the editors. And so there might be one editor, there might be two editors, and then any other relevant publication information, editions, publisher, year. And this is really important with a chapter in an anthology. We want to make sure that we specify the page range because you're not citing the entirety of the book. You're citing a particular work that only occupies a particular section in that larger work. So we want to make sure that we are citing the page range. And so the in-text citation, thankfully for these sources, is pretty straightforward. Once again, it's just going to be the author's last name and the page number. So if you were citing the poem Catch by Robert Francis, the in-text citation would just be Francis space the page number and then a parenthesis period. So that is how you cite sources from an anthology.
And Hannah, correct me if I'm wrong, but we don't then, for your in-text citation, need to cite the editors. We only give them credit on the Works Cited page. Is that right?
You got it. Yes.
Cool. I was like, I think I'm tracking. Wanted to check myself. Well, thank you, Hannah, for helping us work through that list of sticky Citations. I hope that this has been helpful for everyone who is tuning in. And thanks for joining us today on the Ally Advantage. We'll see you next time.